"Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before a Navy helicopter landed on his hospital roof. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General in Houston hum over the night shift, casting blue shadows across polished linoleum that smells of antiseptic and floor wax. Outside, August rain hammers the ER bay doors like applause for something nobody wanted to watch. Megan O'Brien moves through the ICU with deliberate invisibility, her hand steady as she checks vitals on the cardiac monitor, her movements economical and precise. She's been here 2 weeks. Keeps her head down. Says little. This strategy has worked for 15 years. The combat boots sit in her locker behind spare blankets, leather cracked and faded from a decade of dust that no one in Houston knew existed. When she rolls up her sleeves to wash her hands at the sink, faint scars trace her forearms like a roadmap of old violence, thin white lines that tell stories the paperwork says never happened. The surgical scrubs she wears fit her frame the way a sniper's ghillie suit fits, functional, unremarkable, designed for moving through spaces without being seen. Room for 08 is quiet tonight. The Admiral arrived at 2317 on military transport, unconscious, incomplete medical history, no next of kin listed yet. The orderlies had wheeled him in with the kind of urgent discretion that meant someone in the Pentagon had made a phone call. Megan had seen the Navy corpsmen's posture, the rigid spines, the careful distance they maintained from hospital staff. She'd recognized the look. She used to wear it. She doesn't recognize the man on the stretcher. But that wasn't the problem yet. The problem was standing in the nurse's station at 2234, wearing a Rolex and cologne that cost more than Megan's monthly rent, reviewing her intake notes with fingers that had never held a real patient chart or felt a carotid pulse racing against a fingertip in the dark. Dr. James Caldwell, Chief of Critical Care. Harvard Medical School on the wall, which meant someone had paid attention to his resume before they discovered what he was actually doing with the billing codes. He had built a lucrative side business inflating ICU admissions, ordering unnecessary procedures, funneling kickbacks from a medical supply company called Mercer Diagnostics. The scheme required compliant staff. Quiet staff. Staff who didn't ask questions about why certain patients got intubated within 6 hours of admission, whether they needed it or not. Megan had been quiet for 2 weeks until she wasn't. Fresh blood, Caldwell said, not looking up from her file. His voice carried the tone of someone commenting on a mediocre wine. Another physician laughed, Dr. Patricia Hayes, cardiology, someone who'd learned not to ask about Caldwell's patient orders. Learning the ropes, I assume. Megan had been reviewing the sedation protocol on the monitors. Room 302, patient admitted at 2 p.m. with a simple observation hold for chest pain, now listed for a $7,400 endoscopy and marked for sedation protocol class 2, which required continuous monitoring. Unnecessary. She knew sedation protocols because she'd been trained to administer them. She also knew when they were being written up to justify billable hours. She'd flagged it quietly. One small notation in the system. One small notation that Caldwell saw. Learning, he continued, glancing sideways at her with a smile that had won teaching awards and convinced hospital administrators that his patient outcomes were excellent, which they were if you didn't count the 3 families who'd sued for unnecessary intubation and the 2 that had settled quietly. Let's see how long you last, shall we? 7 days sounds about right. The night shift eats people like you alive, Miss O'Brien. He'd made it a bet. Public. Said it loud enough for the other nurses to hear. Said it like he was testing her, the way some men test thin ice by jumping on it. Hayes had laughed again. Someone else in the station had pretended not to listen. Megan had continued reviewing the medication log and said nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 23:06 in the hospital cafeteria when Caldwell appeared behind her as she was loading a tray with lukewarm coffee and a turkey sandwich she wouldn't eat. His hand moved with the sudden precision of someone who'd thought this through, one clean motion, contact with her tray from the side, her lunch scattering across the linoleum like casualties. The coffee cup cracked. The sandwich slid under a neighboring table. A banana rolled to the wall. Butterfingers, Caldwell said, his voice light as air. People turned. 3 other hospital staff watched. A maintenance worker near the door stopped moving. Caldwell picked up a patient chart from the next table, not hers, just whatever was handy, and dropped it at her feet. The pages scattered. "Pick that up, sweetheart. You're new. You should learn how we do things here." His smile was the kind that had convinced hospital boards and insurance companies. His posture was casual. To anyone watching, he was just a busy doctor making a light joke, nothing sinister, nothing actionable, nothing that would stick if she reported it. Megan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hands remained steady as she knelt and retrieved the scattered pages. The chart belonged to room 407. She read the name. She read the billing code. She read the procedure order, another unnecessary endoscopy, another $7,400 charge, another kickback that would land in her account somewhere Caldwell thought was untraceable. She gathered the pages in the right order. Her movements were mechanical and precise. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly, her voice the color of water. Deferential. Soft. The voice of someone who'd learned long ago that compliance was survival. She stood, the chart returned to neutral. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't let anything show on her face except acceptance. "I appreciate the guidance." Caldwell's smile widened. He'd won something. He could feel it. He walked away. Megan cleaned up the rest of her spilled lunch with paper towels, disposed of the broken cup, and returned the banana to the trash bin. The maintenance worker had looked away. The other staff members had found things to do. No one had stepped forward. This was how it worked at Seattle General. Caldwell was too useful, too connected, too financially valuable to the hospital's bottom line. Complicit silence was cheaper than integrity. She finished her shift in room 408, checking the Admiral's vitals at hourly intervals. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate holding in the 80s. Oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters. The patient was sedated, stable, breathing easy. Military transport sometimes brought soldiers who'd survived things that civilian medicine couldn't quite classify, incomplete paperwork that suggested security concerns, histories that ended with a redacted line and a classified stamp. This one didn't look familiar. The Admiral's face was weathered from sun exposure and 40-some years of command decisions. His hands were scarred, real work, not desk work. There was a density to him even unconscious, the way certain men carry weight like a weapon they've learned not to put down. She checked his chart. No next of kin. No emergency contact. No photograph. Just a name and a rank and a DOD reference number that didn't mean anything without the context codes. At 0:56, Megan walked to the employee break room and opened her locker. The combat boots were still there, waiting, patient as bones in a tomb. She didn't touch them. She never touched them when she was at work, never acknowledged them, never let her mind wander to the dust they still carried, the smell of cordite and diesel exhaust that clung to the leather even after 15 years. Instead, she walked to the supply closet. The shelves were stacked with gauze rolls and alcohol prep pads and trauma shears and spinal needles and all the small equipment that kept people alive in increments. She gripped the edge of the middle shelf and held it, her hands going white at the knuckles, her breathing controlled and deliberate. She thought about the tray. She thought about the chart. She thought about the smile. She thought about room 302 and room 407 and how many other rooms had charts that didn't tell the truth. How many patients had been intubated unnecessarily? How many families had been charged for procedures they didn't need? How many people had died in this hospital because Caldwell had orders that prioritized billing codes over patient protocols? The supply closet smelled like latex and sterile paper. She could hear the ventilator hum from the ICU through the walls, a rhythmic mechanical sound like something breathing in an artificial way, like lungs that had given up and surrendered to machinery. Her knuckles ached. She made herself breathe. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. She released the shelf and walked back to the ward. The night shift continued. Vitals were stable. Patient slept. Caldwell was gone, back to wherever he went during daylight hours, probably to a home with expensive fixtures and a wife who'd learned to ask no questions. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless blue song. Rain hammered the windows like something trying to get in. At 2 o'clock, the Admiral's heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Megan checked his vitals with the same precision she brought to every patient. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation. Everything normal. Everything stable. Everything exactly as it should be. She had no idea that the man on the stretcher was going to change everything. She had no idea that in exactly 12 hours, the Admiral would ask for his nurse and say a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. A call sign from a time when she'd been something other than invisible. She had no idea that his grateful hands and the weight of his memories would be the final thread that unraveled everything she'd built since Bagram. She just checked his vitals. Just did her job. Just kept her head down, the same way she'd been keeping her head down for 15 years. The way she'd been trained to disappear. The nurses' station at 0700 was the hub of the morning shift change, where 3 departing nurses handed off their patients to 3 incoming replacements, clipboards passing like sacred relics, voices layered with exhaustion and coffee. Megan stood at the far terminal entering discharge summaries, her fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision, when Dr. Caldwell appeared at the desk's edge. He leaned against the counter as if he owned it, which, in institutional terms, he nearly did. Chief of Critical Care carried weight. His brother-in-law was on the hospital board. His medical school roommate had become a vice president. These facts hung around him like an aura. "I'll make you a bet," Caldwell announced, loud enough for 6 staff members to hear, though only 3 pretended not to listen. The other 3 stopped listening to their handoffs entirely. 7 days. That's how long before you quit. Megan's jaw clenched once. Imperceptibly. Her hands did not pause on the keyboard. "I've seen 100 like you," Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to consequence-free speech. "Think they can handle critical care. Think they're smarter than the system. Then reality hits and they're gone. Burned out. Broken." He smiled at the assembled staff. "Anyone want to take the over-under?" 2 nurses laughed nervously. The kind of laugh that wasn't agreement but rather acknowledgement of power. Megan finished typing the discharge note, "BP stable, O2 sat 96%, patient alert and oriented," and turned to face him. "Yes, doctor," she said flatly. 3 words. Her voice was level as a perfectly calibrated foredrip. No tremor. No heat. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second, then returned to the monitor. It was the kind of response that was technically respectful and absolutely defiant in its lack of effect. The smile left Caldwell's face. That afternoon, the cafeteria during lunch service smelled of industrial gravy and overcooked vegetables, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of exhaustion. Megan carried her tray, soup, salad, a single apple, past Caldwell's table where he sat reviewing something on his phone, pretending to ignore her approach. But she saw his foot move. Subtle. Calculated. The tray tilted. Her grip slipped. No, not slipped. He'd timed it perfectly, that foot extension catching the edge as she passed. The tray hit tile with the sound of small disaster, plastic clattering, soup sloshing in a wide arc, the apple rolling under a chair 4 feet away. The cafeteria went silent the way rooms do when they're watching to see if someone will break. Caldwell looked up from his phone with feigned surprise, as if he'd just noticed her on the floor in front of his table. "Oh, Butterfingers," he said warmly. "Better clean that up." Megan was already moving. She knelt without a word, her face blank as a deactivated mask, gathering plastic utensils, napkins, the broken edge of a foam cup. A younger nurse, Taylor, a night shifter with soft hands, started toward her with paper towels. Caldwell's glance stopped her cold. A single look. Taylor froze, then slowly retreated to her table. Megan collected the apple from under the chair. It had a dark bruise where it had rolled across something, or perhaps from the impact. She stood, tray reassembled, and walked to the trash without meeting anyone's eyes. But later, alone in the employee bathroom, she gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. That evening, near the end of the shift, Caldwell found her in the hallway outside room 402. He was carrying a patient chart, and when he reached her, he simply dropped it. Pages scattered across the tile floor like confetti no one had asked for. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And maybe review basic protocol while you're down there." The instruction was designed to humiliate. Megan understood this. She also understood that she was the only person in the hallway and that he'd chosen his moment carefully. She knelt and collected each page, reading the chart numbers without registering their meaning, her hands steady as they'd been steady in the field, steady as they'd been when she'd carried an 8-year-old boy through 3 miles of hostile territory with rounds impacting everything around them. "Of course, Doctor," she said, straightening. She walked directly to the supply closet, closed the door, and pressed her palms against the metal shelf until her bones felt like they might separate from their joints. Her breathing came through her nose, controlled, disciplined, the kind of breathing she'd learned to do when lying flat in a blooded ditch waiting for extraction. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next was Dr. Caldwell in his office on the 14th floor, his door closed at 1800 hours, making 2 telephone calls. The first was to Thomas Bancroft, the hospital board president, his former medical school roommate, a man he'd pledged with at Princeton, a man who owed him professional favors accumulated over 20 years. "Tom, I'm concerned about someone," Caldwell said, his voice assuming the tone of a peer worried about institutional standards. "New hire on my critical care team. Flagged a billing procedure last week, which is fine, we want oversight, but now I'm wondering if she was properly vetted. Her employment file is sparse. Military background, which is excellent, but some gaps. Red flags, maybe." "What kind of gaps?" Bancroft asked. "I can't quite put my finger on it," Caldwell said. "Might be nothing. But for a VIP case we've got incoming, I want to make sure everyone's qualified. You know how it is." Bancroft said he'd look into it. Caldwell said that was all he could ask. They hung up. The second call was to the Texas Medical Board, to a contact he'd cultivated through a medical supply company that paid him consulting fees, not bribes, never that word, but rather board compensation for his time reviewing their products. The contact's name was Eleanor Price, and she worked in the regulatory office. "Eleanor, quick question," Caldwell said, his tone now confidential. "If a hospital hired someone to work in critical care and discovered their employment documentation was incomplete, who would I notify?" "Depends on the role and the hospital's bylaws," Eleanor said. "Why?" "I may have identified an issue," Caldwell said. "New nurse, military background, but I can't verify all her credentials. No way to confirm licensure during the period she claims to have been working. Just want to make sure we're covering our bases." Eleanor said she could send over an inquiry form. Caldwell said that would be perfect. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the work of 30 minutes. By tomorrow, both the board president and the state medical board would have seeds planted. The seeds might not grow into anything, but they would be growing. And while they grew, while the slow machinery of institutional investigation began its ancient creep, that nurse, the one who'd looked him in the eye for exactly 1 second and made him feel, for the first time in his career, like perhaps he'd miscalculated, would be sweating. At 0700 the next morning, during the shift change brief, Caldwell appeared in the ICU and spoke to the charge nurse, Rebecca, within exact earshot of Megan. "I need to rotate some assignments," he announced, looking at his tablet. "I'm going to need experienced staff on our VIP case, the Admiral in room 408. His Navy, which means scrutiny. By the book, triple-checked orders. I'm moving O'Brien to the telemetry floor." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. Reassignment mid-rotation was unusual without performance review. "The telemetry floor?" she asked carefully. "Intermediate cases," Caldwell said. "Good experience. She'll learn our protocols better there, be ready to come back to critical care once she's settled." It's a training move. Megan was entering vitals into the terminal for her last ICU patient. Her jaw tightened. She didn't turn around. She knew what this was: isolation, reassignment, removal from proximity to the Admiral whose chart she'd been reviewing, whose dosing she'd flagged, whose presence in room 408 had made her remember a life she wasn't supposed to remember. She reviewed his chart one final time before leaving the floor. Admiral James Holloway, age 53, admitted from Bagram transfer facility with incomplete medical history. Unconscious. Vitals unstable. Sedation dosing at 2 mg midazolam every 4 hours, aggressive dosing, the kind that extended ICU time and elevated billing. She'd flagged it. The charge nurse had said she'd pass it along. Nothing had changed. Megan wrote a note on the chart in her precise handwriting: sedation review recommended, dosage appears elevated for patient presentation. She signed it and set it on the desk for the incoming ICU nurse to see. It was all she could do. It had to be enough. That night, lying in her bed while her 10-year-old daughter, Emma, slept down the hall with her nightlight shaped like a crescent moon casting pale illumination across the floor, Megan stared at the ceiling. The darkness was complete except for that thin line of light under the door. She thought about the boy she'd carried, the interpreter's son, bleeding from a fragmentation wound, terrified, calling for his father in Pashto, and she thought about the man he'd become, unconscious 3 floors away from her in a hospital she'd chosen specifically because it was far enough from Bagram, from the Navy, from anyone who might ask questions. She thought about her daughter, who'd asked last week, "Mommy, why can't we ever visit Grandma?" And Megan had said, "Because Grandma can't know we're here, sweetheart." Emma had accepted this without understanding it. Children were good at that, accepting the inexplicable, living inside contradictions their parents constructed around them. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was supposed to be dead. That was the official record. The classified interrogation site at Bagram, the 3 senators who'd sworn it never happened, the black ops that required witnesses to be erased, all of that had been resolved by declaring her KIA, filing the paperwork, sealing it in the archives. She'd walked away from that life, assumed a civilian identity, taken her daughter from her parents, who'd grieved her twice, and disappeared into the American nursing infrastructure. 15 years without a ripple. 15 years of keeping her head down, of being overlooked, of being exactly the kind of person no one paid attention to. And then she'd flagged a billing discrepancy, and a man with institutional power had decided that being overlooked was no longer an option. She closed her eyes. 3 floors above her, an unconscious man whose life she'd once held in her hands was breathing shallow breaths, receiving medication that would keep him sedated longer than medically necessary, and she was not allowed near him. The silence in the dark was complete. The ICU monitors at Seattle General screamed at 01 for 7 hours. Megan was 3 floors down, reassigned to the orthopedic ward, when the central alert flashed across the nursing station screen. Room 408. Cardiac decompensation. She didn't look up from the post-op chart she was pretending to review. Didn't move. The algorithm was simple: see the alert, stay still, let someone else answer. That was how you kept your job after Caldwell had marked you for removal. But the pattern registered anyway. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins climbing up the neck like warning flags. The numbers told a story she'd read in 3 languages across 2 decades. Tamponade. Blood was crushing the Admiral's heart from the inside, and he was 3 minutes away from becoming unreachable. She closed the chart. Set down her pen. Stood. The ortho charge nurse didn't even glance up. No one had spoken to Megan directly in 6 days, not since Caldwell had announced her reassignment in front of the entire morning briefing. The message was institutional now, a weight that hung in every hallway. She was contaminated. Unreliable. The kind of nurse who flagged things that weren't her business. She walked toward the stairwell like her feet belonged to someone else. Like the woman climbing 3 flights of stairs in the dark column of a hospital at 2 a.m. was making a rational decision. The stairwell door swung open on hinges that needed oil, and the sound echoed down the concrete shaft like a rifle shot. 4th floor. She didn't run. Running would trigger the motion sensors. She walked, and her combat boots, still in her locker, always in her locker, the boots that had crossed 14 countries and 6 war zones, seemed to press their weight into memory. The ICU was a controlled chaos of light and sound. 2 attending physicians were working room for 08 with the kinetic desperation of men who knew they were losing. The senior attending, Dr. Hayes, a man Megan had never spoken to but whose reputation ran toward cautious, was reviewing the monitor strip with the posture of someone already writing the death note in his head. The younger doctor, maybe 35, was speaking rapid fire. "We can do a bedside pericardiocentesis. Needle right into the pericardial space, drain the blood, decompress the heart. Standard protocol." Dr. Hayes didn't move. "Too risky. We perforate the myocardium. We've just accelerated the timeline. Cardiothoracic is 20 minutes out. We stabilize, we wait." "He doesn't have 20 minutes. The younger doctor's voice was climbing. "His BP is 60/40. He's in tamponade physiology right now." "I'm aware." Dr. Hayes said this with the flatness of a man protecting himself. The Admiral's monitors shrieked. Oxygen saturation dropping. Pulse thready. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the lungs it inflated were being choked by fluid. Megan stood in the doorway. Neither of them noticed. The senior physician made his decision at 0203. She watched it happen the way you watch a ship sink, the moment visible in advance, inevitable, the only question being how long it took to finish. "Document the time," Dr. Hayes said. "Notify administration. Time of death pending family notification." They began the ritual disconnection. Monitors went silent. The ventilator ceased. The fluorescent light seemed to brighten without the electric percussion of alarms underneath them. 2 men stood back from a bed where an unconscious Admiral, a man Megan had pulled from burning rubble when he was 8 years old, when he was just a bleeding child who'd lost his mother to shrapnel an hour earlier, lay as a corpse waiting for the paperwork. Megan moved forward. Her voice came out the way it always did, measured, quiet, no question mark at the end. "He's not gone." Dr. Hayes turned. His face held the exhaustion of a physician who'd made 30 difficult calls in an 8-hour shift and knew this wouldn't be the last. "You're not assigned to this floor, Nurse O'Brien. This patient is beyond intervention. Leave the room." She didn't move. Didn't argue. That was when Caldwell appeared, having been paged the moment the Admiral's status changed. The senior physician had called him with the news, as protocol demanded for VIP patients. Caldwell's face underwent a transformation as he recognized Megan standing near the bed, his expression sharpening like a predator sensing wounded prey. This was the moment. This was her breaking. "Security," Caldwell said into his radio without looking away from her. "Escort Nurse O'Brien from the ICU. She's interfering with physician decisions." The 2 attending physicians exchanged a glance, the uncomfortable awareness of junior medical staff watching someone get targeted, and moved toward the hallway to begin the family notification process. Caldwell followed. The room emptied. A security guard appeared in the doorway, moving with the hesitant step of a man who knew this situation was something more complicated than his training covered. Megan stood alone with the Admiral's body. She looked at his grey face. Looked at the distended neck veins that had already begun their descent now that his heart had stopped working. Looked at the spinal needle on the crash cart, still in its sterile wrapper, placed there during the failed resuscitation, forgotten in the rush to surrender. The security guard was maybe 50 feet away, banging twice on the metal door frame. "Unlock the door." She closed the door. Locked it. The security guard banged again, harder. She didn't answer. The muscle memory was older than her current name. Older than her nursing license. Older than the 15 years she'd spent pretending to be someone smaller than she was. Her hands moved on their own. Gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. The spinal needle came free from its wrapper with a whisper. She positioned herself beside the Admiral's chest, ribs already cooling, and her hands were steady in a way that had nothing to do with hope. Just knowledge. Just the fact that she'd done this before, not in a hospital, but in a Black Hawk at 3,000 feet with rounds punching through the fuselage and a child's blood on her uniform and only a 14-gauge needle and nerve, and the absolute refusal to accept that this man would die on her watch. The pericardial sac lay beneath the xiphoid process, that small cartilage point where her fingers found the angle between ribs with the precision of a map she'd memorized decades ago. She angled the needle downward at 45 degrees, aimed toward the left shoulder blade, and advanced with the slow certainty of someone who had held lives like this before. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through the thin membrane of the pericardium. And then the give. The release. Blood filled the syringe in a dark surge, the weight that had been crushing the Admiral's heart suddenly mobile, suddenly draining. She pulled back slowly, each draw of the plunger releasing the pressure that had been killing him. The security guard's radio crackled, report from ICU 4. What's the status on O'Brien? The guard's voice came back, uncertain. She's locked in. She's not responding. Megan didn't hear the answer. She was focused on the slow dark blood withdrawing into the syringe, one pull at a time, with the patience of a woman who understood that panic was a luxury she'd never been permitted to own. 20 milliliters. 30. The syringe filled with the evidence of what was wrong, what Caldwell had allowed to remain wrong by keeping her away from this room. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. Sinus rhythm. The monitor behind her remained silent. Disconnected. No trace of what was happening, no digital record, no proof except the warmth of blood in her hands and the fact that the Admiral was no longer grey. She set the syringe down on the bedside table, drew the second needle, and began again. Blood filled the syringe. Dark and steady, 60 milliliters draining from the space around the Admiral's heart. Megan didn't look at the needle, didn't count seconds, didn't listen to the pounding on the locked door. Her hands moved like a surgeon who had performed this exact procedure 100 times under fire in a combat hospital with incoming mortars shaking the walls. Palpate the xiphoid process. Below it, 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. She'd learned this technique not in nursing school but in a forward surgical team tent outside Kandahar with a corpsman bleeding out beside her and rounds impacting sandbags. Her muscle memory was written in blood and survival. The needle advanced through skin, through muscle, through ribs she counted by feel alone. Pop. That was the pericardial sac. That was the release valve. 80 milliliters now, the syringe filling with the pressure that had been crushing his heart, stopping it, killing him while the attending physician stood in the hallway already writing the death certificate. Her sterile field was a patient's chest. Her light source was the thin glow from a phone camera propped on the bedside table. Her assistants were muscle memory and 15 years of fighting to keep people alive when medicine said they were already gone. The Admiral's monitors, still connected, always connected, began registering something other than a dying rhythm. A line appeared on the screen. Then another. Not healthy, not strong, but real. Rhythm. Actual cardiac rhythm returning as the pressure released. Megan kept her breathing steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The pounding on the door increased. Not knocking anymore. Fists. Open this door. Open it now. That was security. That was Caldwell's voice underneath, high and sharp. She didn't respond. She applied gentle pressure at the needle insertion site, held it for 40 seconds, watched the monitors climb. Blood pressure rising. Oxygen saturation lifting. 88%. 92%. The Admiral's color was changing from the gray of the dying back to something that resembled human. She adjusted his foredrip, rechecked his pulse at the carotid, present, strong, steady, and began removing the needle with the same precision she'd used inserting it. Smooth. Controlled. The kind of composure that comes from having already survived worse things than this. At 0219, the Admiral's eyes flickered. His body recognized that he was no longer suffocating, that the pressure was gone, that something had changed. His mouth opened slightly. A breath came that his own lungs pulled, not the ventilator forcing it in. Muscle memory took over. She cleaned the site, applied a sterile dressing, made sure all his lines were secure, stepped back, and waited. The pounding on the door had stopped. She could hear radio chatter from the hallway. Someone saying, possible arrest. Someone else saying, notify the attending immediately. Caldwell's voice, tight with something that might have been anger or might have been panic, I want security in that room now. The lock mechanism clicked. A master key. Caldwell had a master key like every department head, like he'd used it 100 times to interrupt her work, to surprise her, to establish dominance. The door opened at 0227. Caldwell entered first, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that cracked the moment he saw the Admiral breathing on his own, color returning, monitors displaying a heart rhythm that shouldn't exist. Blood pressure 98/62. Climbing. The attending physicians crowded behind him, stunned silent. One of them approached the monitors as if they might be malfunctioning. Megan stood at the foot of the bed, already removing her gloves with the efficiency of someone who had performed exactly the medical intervention she was about to describe. Pericardiocentesis. Her voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a nurse reporting on a routine procedure. Cardiac tamponade. Blood in the pericardial sac was compressing his heart. 85 milliliters of hemopericardium. He was salvageable. She placed her gloves in the biohazard bin with the same care she applied to everything. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He looked at the Admiral, then at the monitors, then at Megan with an expression that cycled through disbelief and calculation faster than the heart monitor could register beats. The attending physicians were already moving closer, checking pupils, listening to breath sounds, confirming what the monitors were already screaming. The patient was alive. The patient was stable. The patient had been declared dead and was now breathing on his own because a night shift nurse had locked a door and performed a procedure that existed outside every protocol, every scope of practice, every rule that Caldwell had spent 6 months weaponizing against her. Caldwell stepped backward into the hallway. His jaw tightened. Megan saw the moment something crystallized behind his eyes, not acceptance, but strategic pivot. He pulled out his phone before the door had fully closed behind him, and she heard his voice drop into the particular tone he used for people who mattered. The situation has escalated. We have a significant liability issue. A pause. A nurse with questionable credentials just performed surgical intervention beyond her scope. Yes. On a military VIP. Another pause. I'm documenting everything. His voice moved down the hallway and out of her hearing, but she knew who he was calling. She'd seen his calendar, seen his notes, understood the architecture of his protection. The hospital board president. His former roommate. His ally. Her hands began to shake now that no one was looking, now that the adrenaline that had kept them steady was draining out and leaving tremors. She clamped them together and returned to the Admiral's bedside, checking every line, every monitor, every detail that might show she had acted with precision and care. She had. It didn't matter. By 0600, when the sun broke over Houston pale and weak, hospital security was escorting her out of the building. Not fired yet, pending investigation. But suspended. Escorted out in her scrubs like a thief, while investigative staff were already pulling her employment file, running her background check, checking her credentials against the Texas Board of Nursing database. The walk from the ICU to the exit felt like walking through water. The building seemed to pulse around her. Nurses she'd worked with for 15 years didn't meet her eyes. One of them stepped closer as if to speak, then didn't, then moved away. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, her hands were shaking badly enough that she sat gripping the steering wheel for 3 minutes before she could turn the key. She couldn't defend herself. That was the geometry of this. She couldn't walk into an investigation room and explain that Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, attached to Naval Special Warfare, had saved more lives in hostile territory than most emergency room physicians would see in a career. She couldn't say that because Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The Navy had erased her file after Bagram. After the black site interrogation facility. After she'd witnessed what happened to 3 Taliban fighters who were supposed to be detained and transferred but instead disappeared into a concrete building with no windows and came out 3 days later not at all. 3 senators swore on their careers that facility didn't exist. So Megan didn't exist. She was Megan O'Brien, RN, Houston, Texas, with 15 years of spotless employment and a certification that now sat in a file cabinet being scrutinized by people who would find nothing because there was nothing there except a woman who learned to keep her head down and her hands busy and her history buried. She drove home through morning traffic, still in her scrubs, and tried not to think about the phone call that would come from the Texas Medical Board. It would come. She knew it would. Caldwell had already made it. She pulled into her driveway at 11:30 and sat in the car with the engine off, watching the house like it belonged to someone else. The blue shutters that her daughter had insisted on. The flower boxes that never quite had the right flowers. The porch where they'd sat last Saturday and eaten ice cream, and her daughter had asked if Mommy got nervous at work and Megan had said no, never. At 11:47, her 10-year-old daughter came home from school via the aftercare program, her backpack dragging behind her, her shoes already coming untied. She opened the front door, dumped her bag on the floor, and walked into the kitchen where her mother sat at the table in her scrubs, still in her scrubs, which was wrong because Mommy never came home at this time. Mommy worked at night and slept during the day and came to school pick up tired but always present. Her daughter's face changed. The casual afternoon drift of school tired became focused, suddenly aware that something had shifted. "Mommy, why are you home?" Her daughter asked the question like asking it might make the answer make sense. Like there could be any explanation that was simple. Megan's hands were on the table in front of her, and she was looking at them the way she might look at a surgical instrument that had betrayed her. She opened her mouth. Closed it. The kitchen was very quiet except for the refrigerator humming and somewhere deeper in the house, the hallway closet door standing slightly open, and inside it, on the shelf where she kept seasonal items, a pair of worn combat boots that she'd brought from her last deployment and never unpacked. Boots that her daughter had asked about once, and Megan had said they were from when Mommy was in the Navy, and her daughter had nodded and never asked again because children didn't press when something hurt too much. "Mommy," her daughter said again, moving closer, her voice smaller now. Megan looked at her daughter's face and realized that the life she'd built to protect her from the truth was collapsing, and there was no explanation she could give that would make it better. There was only the terrible weight of 15 years of lies, and now, finally, the moment where someone she loved was asking her to explain why the fortress had fallen. She had no answer. So she put her arms around her daughter and held her, and said nothing at all, while the house around them waited for the phone to ring. 3 days later, the hospital board convened in the main conference room at Seattle General, 14 people seated around a polished mahogany table that cost more than most nurses made in a year. Dr. Caldwell sat rigid in his chair, a leather folder of fabricated evidence waiting in front of him, billing inconsistencies he'd doctored, complaint forms he'd coached staff to sign, medical board allegations carefully worded to suggest Megan O'Brien was unstable, unvetted, dangerous. The board president opened his mouth to call the meeting to order when the sound cut through everything, helicopter rotors, growing louder, shaking the windows in their frames. The conference room went silent. One board member stood and walked to the window. "There's a Black Hawk landing on the roof right now," she said. "Military markings." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "This is a hospital board meeting. That's not protocol." The conference room doors opened. 4 sailors in dress uniforms entered the room with the kind of precision that made the air pressure change. Their shoes clicked on tile in perfect unison. Behind them came a 2-star Admiral in dress whites, his chest heavy with ribbons that told stories of 40 years at sea. His presence moved through the room like a ship cutting through waves. "Admiral in the room," one of the sailors said quietly. Everyone stood except Caldwell, who remained seated, his face reddening. The weathered security guard who'd worked the night shift, the one who'd served at Bagram 18 years ago, stood in the hallway watching through the glass doors. He went pale. His hand shook as he reached for his radio. "That's Master Chief O'Brien," he whispered to the officer beside him. "That's a goddamn legend. She's a goddamn legend." The two-star Admiral stepped forward to the head of the table. His voice was quiet, which made it more terrifying than a shout. He opened a leather portfolio and began to read, "Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Navy Cross recipient, awarded for extraordinary heroism during Operation Enduring Freedom. 19 documented combat saves. For classified operations, eyes only to JSOC. Recommended for the Silver Star on 3 separate occasions. Current status, active duty, classified assignment, verified at the highest levels of the Department of Defense." He paused. "Let the silence do the work." Caldwell opened his mouth. "This is irrelevant to the medical board complaint. She still performed a procedure outside her scope of practice, still violated hospital." The Admiral from room 408 stood. He was still pale, still moving carefully with the 4-pole anchored to his wrist, but his eyes were clear. He'd been conscious for only 72 hours, and already he'd been asking questions. "Doctor, she performed a battlefield procedure that saved my life. The procedure you ordered your staff to delay until I died." "That's a complete mischaracterization," Caldwell said, his voice rising. "I made a medical judgment based on available data. She doesn't have credentials to perform pericardiocentesis. She doesn't even legally exist in our system." The hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Whitmore who'd been waiting for evidence exactly like this, leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Dr. Caldwell, I'd advise you to stop talking right now." But Caldwell couldn't stop. His carefully built network was crumbling. Her file shows no prior military service, no nursing credentials before 5 years ago. This board has a responsibility to question how someone with falsified records was hired in the first place. The two-star Admiral's voice dropped to command level. "Master Chief O'Brien's records were classified and sealed under federal order following operations I am not authorized to discuss. Her credentials are verified at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Your next word should be either an apology or silence. There are no other options." Caldwell opened his mouth. Closed it. The Admiral from room 408 continued, his voice steady as a fore-drip. "When I was 8 years old, my father was a translator working with coalition forces near Bagram. We were caught in crossfire during a village sweep. I was bleeding. I was going into shock. Master Chief O'Brien carried me 3 miles through active combat fire to an extraction point. She kept me talking. She kept me alive. Then she visited me in secret for years, just to make sure I was healing right. She showed up on leave, out of uniform, and sat with my mother and talked about normal things." He paused. "Then she vanished from my life. Official records said she was dead. I joined the Navy to become worthy of what she'd done for me. I became worthy. And then she came back, and she did it again. She saved my life when everyone else had stopped looking." The silence was thick enough to intubate. A nurse from the ICU, the younger one who'd wanted to help Megan in the cafeteria, the one who'd watched Caldwell mock her, stood hesitantly in the doorway with her phone. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but this has been shared 30,000 times since yesterday. I think you all need to see it." She pressed play on the phone screen. The video, Caldwell in the cafeteria, Megan's lunch tray. His hand moving like it was an accident. The tray shattering, eggs and toast scattering across tile. Then the chart, he dropped the patient chart at Megan's feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His smile. His casual cruelty, captured in 4K resolution, already gone viral across nursing forums and hospital staff groups nationwide. The room watched in silence that felt like it would never end. The board president closed his eyes. He'd recommended Caldwell for this job. They'd roomed together at Stanford. They texted about golf, about their kids' schools, about the easy friendship of men who'd never been tested the way some people were tested. Now he was watching his old friend humiliate a woman with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from never once imagining consequences. What no one in that conference room knew, not yet, was that the video had reached Dr. Raymond Chen, the physician who'd written Caldwell's medical school recommendations, the mentor who'd championed his career, the man who'd built 40 years of reputation on the belief that medicine should be a calling rooted in human dignity. Dr. Chen had watched the video once. Then he'd watched it again. Then he'd spent 3 hours writing. His email went to the board president, the hospital CEO, the Texas Medical Board, and the medical director at Stanford. It began, "I take full responsibility for vouching for James Caldwell, and I will spend the remainder of my career trying to undo that mistake." The letter detailed concerns about character, requested comprehensive ethics investigation, and formally withdrew every professional endorsement Chen had ever given. It was 800 words of a mentor watching his judgment fail and refusing to hide from it. The board president read it on his phone during the meeting, his face going gray. He looked up at Caldwell. "Your privileges are suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. We're opening a comprehensive review of your service, your billing practices, supply orders, and patient care decisions." Caldwell stood. His voice rose to a shout that bounced off every wall in that conference room. "You can't do this. I've brought millions in revenue to this hospital. I have connections. I have allies. But his connections were already deleting his contact information. His allies were already composing careful messages about separation of concerns. The video had 17,000 shares and climbing. Security moved him toward the door. 6 months later, the Texas Medical Board's investigation had exposed everything: systematic billing fraud spanning 3 years, unnecessary ICU extensions generating $440,000 in charges, inflated equipment orders totaling $218,000, kickbacks from a medical supply company, intimidation of staff who questioned his decisions. Dr. James Caldwell's medical license was permanently revoked. He taught CPR basics to bored teenagers at a community college in North Houston for $16 an hour, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy that didn't complain, didn't question his method, didn't video him. The room smelled like old coffee and the particular despair of a man who'd climbed as high as he could and then fell off the edge. Megan O'Brien worked from an office at Joint Base Lewis McChord, her official records quietly restored with a flag requiring executive-level clearance to access. She co-directed a veteran transition program with the Admiral she'd saved twice, once when he was 8 years old and bleeding, once when his heart had stopped beating. They helped special operations personnel move into civilian healthcare, trained them, coached them through the identity shift from warrior to healer. Her daughter worked weekends at the hospital now, studying nursing, understanding finally who her mother had always been. The worn combat boots sat polished on a shelf behind Megan's desk, no longer hidden in a hall closet. Her Navy Cross hung on the wall beside them. On another wall hung a handwritten note from Dr. Raymond Chen, apologizing for the system that enabled cruelty and thanking her for embodying what medicine should be. The note ended, "Teach me how to be better." The final scene, Megan teaching a class of veteran medics transitioning to nursing, showing them proper pericardiocentesis technique on a training dummy. A young former corpsman, hands shaking from PTSD, struggled with the needle angle. His breathing was getting shallow. His eyes were getting distant. Megan put her steady hand over his. "I've got you," she said. "You've already done the hard part. The hard part was surviving. Now you're learning to heal from that survival. That's different. That's possible." She looked up at the class, at faces marked by service and trauma, at people who understood bone-deep what it meant to carry weight, and she said it, "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." If you found Megan's journey as powerful as we did, please subscribe for more stories about the heroes hiding in plain sight, the ones who serve, the ones who speak up against corruption, the ones who give everything because they know the cost of silence. Like this video. Comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? We're reading every response.